Hi everybody. In this video we're going to be learning about the geography of China. This week it's going to be Chinese New Year, so we thought this was a good chance to have a look at this huge country in more detail. And we're going to focus today on its geography. So we're just going to have a little look at Chinese geography in this video for two reasons. One, because China is such an enormous country that we couldn't cover all of it in one video. But also because at the end of this video, you're going to go off and do your own project on China. So we don't want to be giving you all the information. We want you to go and find some of it for yourself. So let's get started. Okay, well, we're going to start with the basics. First of all, where is China? If you look at our globe on the right, you can see that China, from our perspective in Ireland, China is in the far east of the world. It is an enormous country and it covers a huge amount of area. You can see on the map, you can see China, but you can barely see Ireland. We've pointed a green arrow at it for you. So one example is China has an area of 9.6 million square kilometers. Now that's 137 times the size of Ireland. So imagine fitting 137 Irelands into one country. That's pretty amazing. But on top of that, it has a population of 1.4 billion, which is actually a lot more than 137 times Ireland's population. So it has what we call a very dense population. That's when you have a big population in an area that's not so big compared to it. Whereas Ireland wouldn't be considered to have a dense population. Somewhere like Dublin has a very dense population, but the rest of Ireland has people kind of scattered around a bit more. So China has a huge area and it also has the largest population in the world. Its capital city is Beijing, and because it's such a huge country, it shares land borders with a huge number of countries in Asia. So it borders Afghanistan, Bhutan, India, Kazakhstan, North Korea, Kyrgyzstan, Laos, Nepal, Mongolia, Myanmar, Pakistan, Russia, Tajikistan and Vietnam. So it has lots and lots of neighbours. And just to give you an idea of how far away it is, to get from Dublin to Beijing, it would take you 11 hours on a direct flight, and that would be 8,277 kilometers. So it is quite far away. Okay, so when we talk about geography, we're talking about basically studying our planet. What is our planet like? But we can divide geography into two different branches or two different types of geography: physical geography and human geography. So we're going to start off at looking a little bit at China's physical geography. And physical geography tells us like what is the actual land like. So we're talking about what are the mountains like, the rivers, the lakes, the seas, what's the climate like, does this place have deserts? So it's all about the actual world just by itself. Imagine there's no humans there. What is this world like? Now, China is the fourth largest country in the world. So because of that, it has a huge amount of different types of physical geography. Like smaller countries, let's say, for example, Ireland. A lot of Ireland is quite similar. You know, it's got a similar climate in all parts of Ireland. Some parts of Ireland are kind of high up in kind of mountainous areas and some are low down near the coast. But apart from that, there's not a huge difference. Whereas China, because it covers so much area, it can be tropical in some places and it can be almost close to Arctic in other places. It has some of the highest mountains in the world. It also has plateaus, and a plateau is where you have flat land but really high up, like where you would expect to be a mountain. So it's like really high up land that's flat. It has grassland, it has farmland, it has coastal beaches, it has deserts. It kind of has every type of geography you could expect in the world just because it's so big. Now, we're going to have a very quick look at rivers in China. Again, like we said, China is huge. So China actually has about 5,000 rivers. Now, we know that a river is a body of water that flows. It's not still water like a lake. It's flowing water. They usually start in mountainous areas and they flow from there downhill towards the sea. China's longest river, the Yangtze River, is also the third longest river in the whole world, and it's 6,300 kilometers long. It's a really important river in China because even though we said we're talking about physical geography, so just about the land and the world without humans, rivers are very important for humans because there have been ways for humans to travel, they're places humans get water, they transport water around, they make the land nearby good for farming. So this is a really important river in China, and it has been used for centuries for human life. But because of that, it means lots of changes have happened to the river and some pollution. So it has some really interesting animal species that are in danger. So one of them is the Chinese alligator, lives in the Yangtze River, and that's in danger of extinction. And actually in 2006, there was an animal species in the Yangtze River called the Yangtze river dolphin, one of very few species of dolphins that live in rivers instead of seas, and that was deemed to have become extinct in 2006, which makes it the first dolphin species that human beings have made extinct. So really important river, but because it's been used a lot, that's kind of had some effect on the wildlife and the natural environment there. The second largest river in China is the Yellow River, which is 5,460 kilometers long. And that's a really interesting river because it transports a lot of silt. So all rivers transport silt. Silt is basically like mud and dirt that's dissolved into the water of the river. So if you ever look at a river, often the water is kind of more browny than clear, and that's because there's mud and dirt and organic material dissolved in it. So all rivers carry silt, and as they flow along, they leave some of that silt on the sides of the river, which makes that land really good for farming. And the Yellow River is thought to transport the most silt, so it is kind of really heavy with silt. It's loads of silt in it, which means that when it transports that silt through China, the lands close to the Yellow River are really, really good for farming. And the last one we're going to talk about here isn't a river at all, it's a canal. And we know in Dublin there are two canals. A canal is something that looks a bit like a river, but it was actually built by human beings. It's artificial. So our two canals in Dublin were built in the 19th century to transport boats transporting food and farming supplies around the place. So this canal in China, the Beijing-Huangzhou Canal, is a lot older than that. It was built in the 5th century, which is about 2,500 years ago, and it makes it the world's oldest, but at 1,800 kilometers, it's also the world's longest artificial canal, and it was built to transport grain from the farmlands around Beijing into the city. So it was a really important canal, and it still is the world's longest one today. So China is one of the world's most mountainous countries, and mountains are actually really important for human beings, especially high mountains, because very high mountains end up with a lot of snow and ice on them, and that snow and ice then melts and trickles down the mountain in rivers, so it supplies lots of water for human beings. There's lots of different ways that mountains are made, but in general terms, it's basically the plates that are deep, deep underground, tectonic plates. And you might have heard about this if you ever were learning about earthquakes or volcanoes. They're the plates on the surface of the earth, but deep, deep underground. And they move. They move on a kind of a sea of liquid magma. And at times in the past when they have bumped into each other or rubbed against each other or had different ways of kind of interacting with each other, they have kind of made a big rupture in the land, which makes mountains. And generally speaking, over time, these mountains erode, which means they kind of wear down. So when you look at the earth and you see the tallest mountains, it usually means that they're the youngest mountains because they haven't had a chance to wear down. And China has some of the world's tallest mountains. So 7 out of the world's 12 tallest mountains are all in China. And China's eastern border, where it borders Nepal and India, is the Himalayas mountain range, which is the world's biggest and tallest mountain range, and that's where Mount Everest is. So China is a very mountainous region, and later on we will learn a little bit about how that might have affected human beings in China in the past. But in terms of the more natural world, right now, the height of those mountains and the fact that they're so tall and it's not so easy for human beings to live up there means that they have a lot of interesting wildlife that hasn't had too much interference from human beings. So up in those Chinese mountains and the mountains around Asia, you'll find really interesting animals like red pandas, like Bengal tigers, like ibexes, and even, and they're very, very rare and hard to find, even snow leopards. So lots of really interesting geography in the Chinese mountains. Now, the last area in physical geography we're going to mention, and like I said earlier, there's way more to physical geography than what I have covered here, but I want you to go off and find out more about that yourself. But a really important part of physical geography is what we call resources. And resources are basically the things that we get from the landscape as human beings and use. So the most obvious one there is food. Human beings take food from their landscape. We take plants, and some of us eat animals, and we use that part of the natural world to keep us alive. Now, then we take other things from the landscape. So if we think about a long time ago when all we had were stone tools, the only real things we took for the landscape were stone to make our tools and wood to make our houses. But nowadays we take a huge amount of resources from the landscape. We take gas and oil and coal for electricity. We take lots and lots of different metals. You probably know metals like gold and silver and iron and aluminium and lead and zinc, and lots of different kind of minerals, not necessarily metals, things like plutonium you may have heard of, that's used in nuclear power production. So human beings take a vast amount of resources out of the planet around them. And when a country has lots and lots of resources, they sell it to another country. That's called exporting. And when a country doesn't have that resource itself and needs to bring it in from outside, they buy it from another country. And that's called importing. So China is one of the world's biggest exporters and one of the world's biggest producers of resources. So they have lots and lots of coal and oil and natural gas. They're also number one in the world for mining gold, zinc, lead, iron, and coal. And as well as that, as well as those kind of fossil fuels for producing electricity, they also produce a lot of renewable energy through hydroelectricity. So that's electricity generated by water, so generated by waterfalls and rivers and dams. And China has the world's largest hydroelectric power plant, which is called the Three Gorges Dam. And that one dam by itself produces 4 times as much electricity in a year as every single power station in Ireland put together. So they've lots and lots of resources in China. And in a little while, we're going to see how this is where physical geography, so just the world around us, connects with human geography, which is how humans will use the world around them. So human geography is, how do human people use the world around them? How do they live? And how is that connected with their landscape? So this works in 2 ways, really. The landscape affects how human people live, but how human people live affects the landscape. So it's like a 2-way street. So an example of that would be, how does your landscape affect how you live? Well, a long time ago in China, China was what we call an isolated country. For a large part of its history, it didn't have as much interaction or as much to do with the countries around it as other countries tended to do. And one of the main reasons for that was to do with its landscape. So it had huge mountains near its borders and huge distances within China itself. So that meant it was hard for people from other countries to come and visit China. And generally we see people from Europe and people from China interacting and trading a lot in about the 13th century. But before that, we don't see a lot of trade and interaction between those 2 areas, just because China was very difficult to get to. So that's one example of how your physical geography affects the way you live. Another example tends to be, where do you live? So is it easy to live in a house up at the very top of a mountain? Or is it easier to live in a house in a valley where there's nice farmland near a river? And you tend to notice this when you look at where human cities and towns are. They tend to be near rivers or near coastal regions because those are the easiest places to live. Now, how do human beings affect their landscape? Well, I think we all know about this now because we know about global warming, and we know that the activities that human beings do can have a very serious effect on their landscape. We know at the moment we're worried about climate change. If we were to look at China for an example, one example is the Three Gorges Dam we were talking about earlier. When you build a hydroelectric power dam, you need a reservoir, which is like an enormous, almost pool of water to keep the water in. And to make that reservoir, they had to flood huge areas of land, which meant they had to get people in the towns and villages living there. They had to get them to move to other places. So they made a huge change to their landscape. An area that was once dry land with people living on it is now all underwater. So that's a really big landscape change. The other big one in China you've probably heard about is the Great Wall of China. So that was built a very long time ago to defend parts of ancient imperial China from the people outside. And they built a huge structure. And in this case, they affected their landscape so much that you could actually see it from space. And it still remains the only human building that you can see from space. So that's a very obvious example. So in these next few slides, we're going to look at human geography. So we're going to focus on industry, which is how humans use the landscape to kind of make money or make things that they need. And we're going to look at settlement, which is how people live. Do they live in towns? Do they live in cities? That sort of thing. But human geography covers an awful lot more than this. It covers religion, culture, how people move around, how people go from place to place and country to country, what people's lives are like on a daily basis. But like I said, we can't cover everything in this video, so we're going to leave those ones for you to maybe look up later. So one of the most important types of human geography to look at is what we call industry. And industry just means, what do people do? How do they make money? How do they stay alive? And we've three types of industry. So the first one is primary industry. And that's the simplest type of industry. That means really just getting stuff from the world around you. So farming, you're getting plants and animals and fish from the world around you. It's as simple as that. Forestry, you're cutting down trees. Mining, you're taking coal or metals or oil or gas out of the ground. So that's primary industry. And most countries back a long time ago in history, primary industry was basically most of what they did. Most of what they did was farming to generate food. But as countries have evolved and become more modern, it's a much smaller part of what they do every day. In China, it takes up 10%, which doesn't sound like much, but it actually is one of the biggest primary industries in the world. So 10% of what China does is in mining and farming, which actually is quite a lot compared with other countries. Secondary industry basically means taking that stuff, so taking those resources that you got from your primary industries and making something new with them. So it would be all about manufacturing and factories. So let's say, for example, if we were to look at mining, iron is a primary industry, but getting the iron and turning it into steel and turning it into the metal beams that we use in making buildings, that's secondary industry. Or, for example, taking oil out of the ground is a primary industry, but when you bring that oil into a factory and you make it subject to different chemical processes and you eventually turn that oil into plastic, that's a secondary industry. So secondary industry is all about using what we got from the primary industry and making new things with it. And generally we say manufacturing. Again, China is pretty much the world leader in manufacturing. 45% of what China does is manufacturing, and that could be anything. You know, it could be clothing, it could be technology, it could be medicines. Lots and lots of stuff is manufactured in China. The final one, tertiary industry, is not really as connected to those first two as they're connected to each other. So tertiary industry means services. So that means when humans do things for other humans. So that would be things like retail, so your shops and shopping centre, hospitality, so your restaurants and your hotels and your leisure centres, A lot of technology can be a tertiary industry as well, so it's like your software developers and all of that. So again, that's about another 45% of what China does, which is a really big difference because up until 20 years ago, China didn't have as well developed a tertiary industry. It wasn't as big a part of what they did. And now, again, they're probably one of the biggest countries in the world for doing those sort of jobs, those sort of jobs around hospitality, retail, tourism. So big changes in China there over the last 20 years. So we're going to talk about one other type of human geography before we finish up. Like I said earlier, there are an awful lot of different things that would come under the term human geography, but we don't want to tell you everything about Chinese human geography in this because we want you to go and find out more for yourself. So settlement is how do people live? So where do they live? What sort of places do they live? Do they live in towns? Do they live in cities? Do they live in houses off by themselves? That's what settlement means. And like I said earlier, settlement is often very much influenced by physical geography. So, it's much harder to live up at the top of a really high mountain than it would be to live on a nice flat farmland near a river. So physical geography and this part of human geography have a big connection with each other. So two of the main types of human settlement are rural and urban. So rural means the countryside and urban means towns and cities. And you'll know this from Ireland that in a rural area in Ireland you might have little small villages, or you might not have villages at all. You might just have single houses out in the middle of nowhere all by themselves. And also we would know that in rural areas farming tends to be very important because there's a lot of land that's not being used by humans living on it. So what we tend to do instead is we use it for growing food or for keeping animals. So in China, life in rural China can be very, very different from life in urban China, but also can be very, very different depending on where in rural China you are. So China, once upon a time, was a very rural country. Most people lived out in the countryside, farming, not in big cities. Today, there's less people living in rural areas, and rural areas have kind of changed. So you could live in a rural area in China where you have your own little house and your own small farm. And generally, if you're in that type of rural area in China, you would be having your small farm, you might be farming rice, you might be looking after some animals, but it would be very much a kind of a simple type of farming where you would use hand tools, you wouldn't use a lot of machinery, and the people there can often not have a lot of money. Then there's parts of rural China where they have massive, massive, huge farms, what we kind of call industrial farms, where it's an enormous farm with loads of people working on it and where lots of machinery and lots of technology is used. So that's just to show that when we think of an area in the countryside, it's not always all the same. You can have very different types of farming and very different sorts of lives in a rural area. And in China, there's definitely a huge difference between a massive, massive industrial farm and a smaller farm that's just owned by one or two families. When we look at urban China, that's where things get huge. So China has an enormous amount of cities. So China has over 100 cities that have more than 1 million people in them. So that doesn't mean they have over 100 cities. They have an awful lot more than that. But in terms of cities that have more than 1 million people in them, they've more than 100. Now, if you think of it, in Ireland, we only have one city that has more than 1 million, which is Dublin. So China has like 100 Dublins. And some of those cities, like Shanghai and Beijing, we're not talking about 1 million or 2 million. We're talking about, in Shanghai's example, 25 million people, and in Beijing, about 20 million. So they have some of the world's largest cities. If you look at the world's top 10 cities, 2 of those, Shanghai and Beijing, are in China. But what's very interesting here is that this is a huge change for China. So 40 years ago, less than 18% of Chinese people lived in a city. But now it's 60%. So it's been a really big change, and life in Chinese cities is very busy. There's lots of people, there's lots of things going on. Like when we looked at the industry, people could be working in any sort of industry. If they were living in a Chinese city, they could be working in technology, they could be working in manufacturing, they could be working in hospitality or retail. So they're really, really busy places, and a big change for China to have gone from having not as many cities to lots and lots of people living in cities. So like I said, that's just industry and settlement that we've looked at there. There's lots more that you could look at, and we'll have a think about that in a moment. So I hope you enjoyed our video so far. I said at the beginning we were only going to cover 1 or 2 areas of Chinese geography, and we weren't going to tell you everything about them, because now we would like you to go and do your own geography project. So you're going to pick an area of geography, and you're going to go off and you're going to research that yourself. Your project could be written, it could be recorded, it could be a sound recording, it could be a video. But one thing I would say is that when we talk about a project, we're not just talking about facts. We'd like to see images. So we'd love to see drawings, illustrations, photos. So make it more about just a bit of writing. It's got to be something that's going to be very interesting for other people to look at. Secondly, please remember that when you do go and look up information, you can't just take sentences directly off a website or directly out of a book and just put them down and say, I'm done, because then that's not your work, it's someone else's. So when we do writing for projects or any type of factual writing like this, we're reading information from a source and then we're making that our own and putting it into our own words. But I know you understand that already. So now what are you going to do your project on? Well, it's totally up to you. I'm going to show you a few examples. So you could be really specific here. So you could say, I just want to research Chinese rivers and lakes. You could do that. You could say, I just want to research the lakes. I'm going to go and find rivers and lakes, and I'm going to find out loads of information just about that one topic. And that would be okay. That would be quite cool to see a really specific, detailed project about rivers and lakes. Or you could say, well, I'm more interested in human geography, so I'm going to do just industries. So I'm going to go and I'm going to find out what are the industries in China, what do people work at, and that's all I'm going to research. So again, that would be a very specific project, and that would be okay. Or you could see if you did one that connected physical and human geography. So you could say, well, I'm really interested in mountains. So I'm going to study the mountains, but I'm also going to study settlements. So what are people's houses and villages like up in the mountains? So there you're connecting one area of physical geography with one area of human geography. And that would be cool as well. You could go broader and you could say, I'm going to look at all of the physical geography of China. I'm interested in all of it. That would mean you'd probably be going into a little bit less detail about each bit, because you couldn't do a huge amount of detail on every single type of physical geography because it would take you too long. But that would be a broader project. Or likewise, you could do the same thing. You could say, I'm going to look at all of the human geography. I want to find out a bit about all of the different things that happen in China. Or you could go broadest of all and you said, I'm just going to look at China. I'm going to say a little bit about each bit here. So it's up to you. See what you find most interesting. So we have our physical geography, which is fairly self-explanatory. Our rivers and lakes, mountains, deserts, seas, climate and resources. Human geography, our industries, just to remind you, that kind of means what do people work at? Settlement, how do they live? Where are their houses, their cities, their town? Culture, that would be around people's religions or their beliefs or their history. Daily life, you could do something as simple as saying, I'm going to see what is life like for a child in China. What time do they get up at? Where do they go to school? What do they do in school? What are their hobbies? Travel and migration, that means what is it like to travel within China? What are their transport links? What's it like to travel outside of China? And migration could mean, where are there Chinese people living in other parts of the world? So, for example, we know from studying the Irish famine that Irish people went and they moved to countries all over the world and they have their own communities in different countries. So you could look at that from a Chinese perspective and say, what are the different Chinese communities maybe in Ireland or America or different countries? And our last one there, landmarks. What are the cool things to go and see in that country? I'm sure you know about the Great Wall of China, but what are the other things? So that's just to give you a little idea. You could go specific, you could go broad, or you could go very broad. It's all up to you. But I hope you enjoy studying that, and we can't wait to see what you come up with.